Let's continue working on our new composable called stopwatch that we have created in the previous lesson. So let's go inside the file with this composable stopwatch.js and look at this composable more closely. And right away we can notice that this composable is currently tightly coupled with timeline item object, because it has a lot of knowledge of this object and it tries to even manipulate it. So in this lesson, let's try to refactor this composable so that it will become isolated, so it will not have any knowledge about timeline item objects. And in order to do so, the first step that we can make is actually accept only amount of seconds in this composable from outside instead of accepting the whole timeline item object. Because at the end, the main goal of this composable is to actually manage stopwatch, but not timeline item object. So instead of passing the whole timeline item object from timeline stopwatch component, what I'm going to pass instead is the actual amount of seconds that this timeline item object stores inside activity seconds property. And then inside our composable, we can call the new parameter initial seconds, and we're going to initialize our local state with this value like this. So next what we're going to do is actually try to get rid of the rest of mentions of timeline item object in this composable, because currently, as we can see, this composable is trying to manage this timeline item object by calling update timeline item function in several places. So instead what we can do is actually not to try to manipulate timeline item object in here, since this stopwatch composable shouldn't have any knowledge about timeline items, but we can call some kind of a function handle seconds change that we're going to receive as a parameter in this composable, and this function is basically going to be executed anytime the local state of this stopwatch changes. So whenever time changes every second, we're gonna execute handle seconds change function and pass in current value of the stopwatch. So now let's declare the second parameter for this composable, which we're going to call handle seconds change. And by accepting this parameter, which by the way will be a function, we'll add all components that are going to use our composable. Specify custom logic in the form of the closure that should be executed on every seconds change. And what I mean by that is this. So for example, inside timeline stopwatch component, we're using this composable. So let's just pass closure as a second parameter into this call. This closure is going to take current time of this stopwatch as a seconds parameter, because as you remember, inside a stopwatch composable, we are passing current time of the stopwatch as the first parameter into this function. And now all the logic that should be executed anytime value of seconds change, we're gonna place this logic in this closure. So anytime when seconds change, we're going to update activity seconds property of certain timeline item object by executing update timeline item function. That's pretty much the same code that we were executing before. We have just moved things around and extracted this piece of code out of the composable and put it directly in this component. And this way we're slowly decoupling our useStopwatch composable from timeline item objects. And now, since we're passing current time of the stopwatch as the first parameter into this function, we can simplify the code in this closure by simply assigning received value of seconds directly to activity seconds property of timeline item object. And by the way, we need to reference timeline item object by using props object in this component. Also, we have to import update timeline item function in this component. So let's cut the import from the stopwatch.js and move it into timeline stopwatch component. So let's continue our decoupling refactoring, and next what we're gonna extract out of the composable will be registration of this watcher. So let's cut it from here and move it into timeline stopwatch component. And of course, timeline item object should be referenced via props object in both places. Then let's also move an import of the function watch into timeline stopwatch component. I'm gonna write this import statement right here. Next, going back to our stopwatch composable, and just like we have done in here, where we called handle seconds change, we should also call the same function when we reset the time of the stopwatch, and this will be happening inside the reset function. And since in here as the first parameter we are already passing the amount of seconds that we're going to assign to activity seconds property of the timeline item object, we can just swap these two lines around. So firstly, we're gonna reset the local state of the stopwatch by assigning 0 to the seconds reactive variable, and then we're gonna pass already reset value into handle seconds change function. So this value will be assigned to activity seconds property of timeline item object. So now it's time to check our refactoring in the browser. See if our stopwatch still functions properly. Let's start tracking the time and make sure the time will be decreasing on activities page. And then let's also check if we still can stop this stopwatch. And then reset the time of the stopwatch. And on activities page, we're supposed to see that all remaining time of activities will also be reset. That's what we are seeing. So this behavior is also working. Now let's go back inside the file with the composable function. And as we can see, we can remove update timeline item import since it's no longer used. And now after looking at our composable representation, we can see that this composable has no knowledge of timeline item object, and all it does is actually declares internal state of the stopwatch and also declares a couple of functions to manage this internal state. And we have also implemented the way of specifying custom logic that should be executed anytime value of the seconds change inside a stopwatch by simply passing the second parameter into this composable, which will be closure with custom logic. And by the way, if we look at those places where we're executing the handle seconds change function inside the composable, we can see that in both places we are passing current value of the local state variable seconds. But the thing is that we are already extracting this local state variable in our timeline stopwatch component, so there is actually no need to pass any parameters into this closure, so we can remove this first parameter and actually reference local seconds variable directly. But since this is a reactive variable, we have to reference value property like so. And technically, after modifying code in this way, we haven't changed any logic. And by the way, let's look at these two function calls, update timeline item here, and also in this watcher. They look identical. So we can extract this logic into a separate function. We can create a local function with the name, for example, update timeline item activity seconds, and paste in here that function call of update timeline item. And now instead of repeating ourselves and calling update timeline item function twice, we can just reference our new function update timeline item activity seconds here as well as inside the watcher. So let's also replace this line with the reference to the new function update timeline item activity seconds like so. And finally, let's go back one more time to our composable function. And here, when we're calling handle seconds change function, we don't need to pass any parameters anymore. So let's remove this param here, as well as inside the second call. And eventually, let's do final testing. As always, I'm gonna start tracking the time for the activity and make sure the time will be decreasing on activities page. This is working. And then let's just try to stop this stopwatch. Change activity in this list, then let's start this stopwatch again. In an activities page, we are supposed to see that the time for a different activity will be decreasing. So far so good, and after time was reset, on activities page, all components that display remaining activity time should also be reset. So as we can see, it worked. As always, the link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.